A few weeks ago, I made mention of the fact that that there are times when it is difficult to preach for various reasons. Sometimes you come to passages that are difficult. Sometimes you come to passages that are difficult to apply. And this is one of those times where this is a very difficult passage to preach. My job fundamentally, if you think about it, is to convince you that something is true that you will actually go out and do. I mean, if you think that you're just sitting here listening to something entertaining, well, you're misleading yourself because, first of all, I'm not very entertaining. And secondly, that's not the purpose of preaching. The purpose of preaching is to convince you in your mind of something that's true, which affects the way that you think, which then affects the way that you act. Right? So I've got to come this morning and convince you of something that's going to be extremely difficult to convince you of. So this is a hard passage to preach. Because I have to preach to you this morning about how we as followers of Christ should be content. And yet we live in a world in which everything around us is designed to make us discontented. Everything around us is designed to make us discontented. Think about it. We used to call this the information age. I don't think that's the right term anymore. I think we should now call it the advertising age. Because everywhere you go, there's advertising. I saw a blurb this week that they are now floating barges on the water in Miami Beach with gigantic billboards. So even as you go down to the beach and you stand on the shore and look out to the ocean, what you see are barges with giant billboards on them. So you can't go anywhere nowadays without advertising. And what is the purpose of advertising? The purpose of advertising is to make you discontented with what you have. That phone that you have, just not good enough. You need the latest one that's being offered by the big company in Japan that's making them, see. And that shampoo that you're using just doesn't give you the right sheen of your hair that you need, see. You need something else. That's what it's designed to do. It's designed to drive us from what we have to what we should want, which is whatever they're hawking, right? And what about social media? The pariah of modern day society, in my ever so humble opinion. Social media, right? Driving us to comment on every imaginable circumstance of life, to somehow condense our entire existence into 280 characters, again and again and again. It's to drive us to comment on everything and to make us feel discontented. In fact, let me give you a little secret. I abandoned Facebook about 6 months ago. And I can tell you my life is much more contented. You ought to try it. And what about politics? Shall we venture into that particular category? We live now in a politics, which is really not politics anymore. Now it's personal realities and identities driving us to find offense in every position that doesn't match ours perfectly. Now we're offended by everything and anything that someone says or does or believes out there in the world, and we're dividing ourselves more and more. The whole world, everything around us, is designed to make us discontented, to remove any sense of contentment that we have in our lives. Now, why is this? Why is this? Because, number one, we live in a world that is fallen. It's been corrupted in every way by sin and evil. Okay, so we live in a world that's fallen. We live in a world that's been corrupted by sin in every single way. Every single thing that's good is corrupted in some sense by evil and sin. And then secondly, go along with that, we are physical creatures. We are creatures that are utterly dependent on the material world for survival. We are utterly dependent upon the dust of the ground from which we came for our survival. We have to eat the plants that grow from the ground, or the cows that eat the plants that grow from the ground. We breathe the air that's produced by the plants that grow from the ground. Our clothing is made from the plants of the ground or the various substances that we draw from the dust of the ground, and so on. We're utterly dependent upon the things of this world, the material world around us. Thus, because we live in a fallen world and because we are material beings, we have a strong tendency to migrate in focus from what we need to what we want. It is our tendency as fallen human beings, utterly dependent upon this world, to migrate in what we focus on from what we need to what we want. And we do this all the time. Let me quote to you one of the great philosophers of our age, a man by the name of Gordon Gekko. Anybody know that name? Gordon Gekko was the chief protagonist of the movie Wall Street, which was released in 1987, played by Michael Douglas. And he has in that movie one of the most iconic lines in moviedom, in which he says, standing in front of a group of stockholders, he says, and I quote, "Greed, for lack of a better term, is good. Greed clarifies, it separates." Now, of course, what he meant is, it's the impulse that drives us to want more. The impulse that drives us to want more, thus exerting effort to better our condition. In a sense, that's what capitalism is. Western economic systems are built on this idea of human beings wanting more. Thus, they go out and exert energy in order to create and invent and build. And thus people come along and say, yes, I want that, and they buy it, and entire economies are built on it. And so it's all fine. That is all fine if it's explored under the creation mandate of God, as it's established in Genesis 1, where God said to Adam, take dominion over all things. I have made all things for you. It is for your good and for my glory. Take all things, use them, and glorify me with them. But it becomes horrible when it's extended by sinful men, by a sinful world, by enslaved creatures to the dust of the ground, into a constant state of displeasure. When it's never enough. When there's always more. When there's always more. In other words, to say it more simply, discontentment is common in a world of sin. Permeates every aspect of the human experience in the fallen world. Discontentment is normal in a fallen world amongst creatures that are beholden to the dust of the ground. We cannot escape it. Even within the church itself. This discontentment doesn't stay outside the doors of the church. It comes even into the body. It comes even in amongst believers as we bring it with us from the outside world into the church itself. There is discontentment all around us. But as we approach the final verses of this section of 1 Timothy 6, we're reminded of this vital thesis. Contentment is a vital characteristic of godliness. Notice the contradiction or tension. Contentment is a vital characteristic of godliness. To be godly, to have an understanding and respect of God that affects the way that you live. To be godly is to have a strong sense of contentment in whatever circumstances God has ordained over you. It's contrary to the laws of nature. The law of nature says, be discontented. The law of God says, be content in your circumstances. It is a massive difficulty, isn't it? That's why it's hard to preach on contentment. Because even though I'm going to tell you to be content, your natural response will be to be discontented in all things. Paul has been insisting, I should say, that a correct definition of godliness, to truly understand what it means to be a follower of Jesus Christ as one who is godly, in other words, imitating God, must include a strong sense of contentment. If you're going to truly understand and recognize who God is and respect Him, is that you're going to have to recognize His sovereignty over all things, thus be content in them by choice. An active will to be content in the things of God. Now, in chapter 6, we've already been addressing this particular subject now for 2 previous weeks. The first week, we looked at verses 1 and 2a, where Paul intimates that slaves should act in a way that demonstrates they are content in their situation. As they work, especially for believing masters, they should honor their masters by the work that they do, but that demonstrates a contentment. It demonstrates a contentment. Then starting in 2b and going through verse 5, Paul explains that contentment, this concept of being happy or satisfied in your circumstances, has a strong doctrinal component. Our state of contentment in this life stems from our understanding of things as those things are revealed to us. It doesn't just come out of the blue. It comes out of an understanding. It starts as God reveals His will through His Word into us, and as we glean more and more understanding of these things, the result of that is it produces, or should, greater contentment, a greater sense of satisfaction with not only who He is, but what our circumstances are. You see, Paul is confronting the false teachers at Ephesus. And they believe that their so-called teachings are a means that can produce gain for them. We'll come back to that word in a minute. They can satisfy their discontentment, or yours, through means other than doctrinal or theological components of the apostolic message. You see, they believe they can make you content without teaching you anything of truth. It's possible, they say, to find contentment in their teachings, which are inconsistent with what God has revealed. Their heterodoxy, their unorthodox teachings, their false teachings, Paul calls them, are designed specifically, Paul says, to lead you away from grounded, sound apostolic gospel to something else. Probably the greatest example of this would be teaching that is fundamentally emotional in core. Emotionalism. The goal is to make you happy. And if you become happy, you will be content. But as I argued last week, happiness and contentment are not the same thing. They're not the same thing. There's a doctrinal component to this concept of contentment, and this is where we need to start. But now, in verses 6 to 10, Paul will come to his young protege via this letter and confront the most obvious area of discontentment that we face. Again, as creatures who are beholden to the dust of the ground, this is going to be the most obvious area of discontentment that we will face. So now let's read together verses 6 through 10. But godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into the world, and we cannot take anything out of the world. But if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. But those who desire to be rich fall into temptation, into a snare, into many senseless and harmful desires that plunge people into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all kinds of evils. It is through this craving that some have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many pangs. Now let me just deal with something very quickly here as we come to the to these verses. There is a textual variant in front of you in verse 6. If you're using a King James version of the Bible, you will notice that there's an extra phrase added to the end of verse 6. It says in verse 6 in the King James, "But godliness with contentment is a great gain. From such withdraw yourself." That little phrase is not included in most modern translations. In fact, the ESV doesn't even have a footnote mentioning that it's not there. The newer translations assume from older manuscripts that the phrase is not original. And there's good arguments on both sides of the equation as to whether it belongs or not. Does it belong here or not? However, I would argue that the spirit of the indicative, this phrase, "from such withdraw thyself," would be in keeping with the intention of the apostle. I mean, however it got there, whether Paul wrote it or somebody added it later in a manuscript somewhere along the way, no matter in either case, it is, in fact, okay for it to be there. It's not wrong necessarily. Now, I'm convinced it's not original, but it's the sense and the spirit of it is right. I mean, what does it say? From such withdraw thyself. Keep away from such people. That's good advice, right? From people who are trying to teach you their false teachings in order to produce gain for themselves. It would be consistent for Paul at this point to say, stay away from those people. Okay, so it's fair for the statement itself. So even if it's difficult to know if it was original, the inclusion or non-inclusion of the phrase doesn't change the basic construction of the verses. It doesn't alter the basic assumption of the paragraph, right? So we got that out of the way. Now, I want you to look closely at verses 5 and 6. If you are paying attention here, you will notice that Paul actually uses a slight play on words between the two verses. Look carefully, you will notice that both verses use two words. Both verses use two words. The first word is godliness. The second word is gain. Okay? Paul uses the same two words. They become the two primary words of the two verses. And yet, would you not agree with me that what Paul writes in verse 5 is very different from what he writes in verse 6? Yet he uses the same two words. He uses the same two words, and he adds a word in verse 6. And it's the addition of this word, and that word is contentment. The addition of the word contentment changes the connotation of verse 6 entirely. Now, look at verse 5. In verse 5, Paul uses gain pejoratively. He uses it negatively. He's speaking about a form of gain that is inconsistent with being a Christian. Now, from what we can glean from what Paul will say starting in verse 7, it's obvious that Paul is speaking here about gain that is entirely material in substance. It's gain that is entirely selfish or greedy. It's a gain that is designed to make profit for oneself, which is not in keeping with what God would have from us. It's not a proper type of gain. So then in verse 6, Paul uses the same word, porismon, gain, but he uses in this case positively. In fact, he even adds an adjective, it, great gain, that Christians should be all about. And in the second verse, in verse 6, Paul implies that this form of gain is entirely spiritual. It is a gain that is entirely good in the sight of God. This is where I got my thesis from. That godliness must have contentment as a vital characteristic. It's the inclusion of the phrase with contentment that changes the structure of the sentence entirely from one that is negative to one that is positive. Paul says there's a whole lot of people pursuing gain in the church. Some are pursuing it wrongly, and some are pursuing it rightly. And the difference between the two is simple. One group is never content, the other group is content. And the type of gain that is produced, although different in substance, is in fact similar by word. It's similar by word. So it is the inclusion of the phrase with contentment that makes the point. A reverence for God, that is godliness, that is willing to accept whatever has been ordained by God, that's the second. Rather than a form of religion, godliness, that is constantly pursuing what is better. Constantly pursuing what is better. Contentment is a vital characteristic of true biblical God-honoring godliness. The difference between the godliness of the false teachers is that their godliness is based nothing more than religion. It's external, it's temporal, and it has only one goal: to build their pocketbooks. The goal of the second type of gain is one that is spiritual, it is eternal, and it is Christ-honoring because it is built on the foundation of contentment. So let me ask you this question. What does this contentment look like? How is it defined? What does contentment really look like? Paul gives in verse 7 one of the most obvious statements of truth ever printed on paper. This is a fun commentary because this is a verse that should just be like, duh. It's something so obvious it shouldn't even have to be said, right? When Paul says this, what he says is, we brought nothing into this world with us, nothing material with us into this world, and we can take nothing material with us out of this world. When you were born, you brought nothing with you, and when you die, you take nothing with you. It's like the old church sign. You never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul. You never see a hearse pulling a U-Haul. As I was reading this verse, I couldn't help but think of a joke that my friend Brother Kerry up in Mississippi likes to tell. He talks about a man who arrived at the pearly gates with 2 giant bags of gold. And he said to Peter at the gate, he said, you know, I earned this during the course of my life. I worked very hard for this. This is the accumulation of my wealth for the entirety of my life, and I want to bring it with me into heaven. And Peter bursts out laughing at the man. And the man asks him, why are you laughing at me? And Peter continues to laugh, and at that moment, Paul walks by, and Peter turns to him still laughing and says, Paul, come and check this out. There's a guy who wants to come into heaven with 2 great bags of paving material. Now, if you don't get that joke, the streets of gold and the streets in heaven are paved with gold. Okay, get it now? All right, there you go. There we go. We brought nothing into this world. Yes, I know that there are many who are born into wealth and privilege, but they didn't bring it with them. It was already here. They didn't bring it with them. They may have been born into it, but it wasn't something that they brought. And in death, we will leave everything material behind, even our own bodies we will leave behind in death, as they will fall back to the dust of the ground. Now, that's an obvious statement, isn't it? But is there maybe something greater under this verse that Paul may be driving at? Something more than just the obviousness of the fact that when we die, we take nothing from this world that we may have accumulated? And I think so. You see, a Christian worldview, a worldview based on the Bible, sees human beings as physical creatures, as I said before, right? We are dust of the ground. We were formed from the dust of the ground. To the dust we shall return, and we are utterly beholden to the things of the ground. A Christian worldview sees us in this fashion, created from the dust of the ground, but endowed with the imago Dei by our Creator. We are creatures who are both mortal and immortal. We are mortal in that God created us as dust, but we are also immortal in that we possess the image of God in us. He breathed into that first man, Adam, after he had formed him from the dust of the ground, and breathed into him all of those godlike attributes that he wished to communicate to this race. Thus, we have the ability to think. have the ability to reason. We have the ability to emote. We have the ability to choose. We can speak. We have conscience. We have consciousness and sentience. There's a sense of morality and ethics within us that is not found in the animal kingdom. We are unique amongst all the creatures of the world because God breathed into us His own nature into us. And this is fundamental to a Christian worldview of an understanding of man. But in death, the mortal and the immortal, the body and the soul, are ripped apart. And I'm choosing those words perfectly, or intentionally. Ripped apart. It is the unnatural severing of the two intertwined elements of human existence. When God breathed into the dust to make Adam a living being, the intention was for that to be intertwined in such a way that it would never be separated. That there would always be the imago Dei in this pile of dust, and this pile of dust would in fact be immortal, not mortal. When Adam sinned, he brought a curse upon himself and upon his race, such that we will all at one time experience this horrific ripping apart of the mortal from the immortal. Upon dying, then, we bring only one thing with us into the presence of God. We bring the state of our immortal soul. That's all we bring into the presence of God upon death. The body falls back to the ground, and the immortal soul that has been breathed into us by our Creator goes to God, and all we bring with us then is the state of that immortal soul. So either we bring a soul into the presence of God that continues in utter rebellion against Him, that hates Him, that will not submit to the law of God, but demands its own way in all things, or we bring a soul that loves God because it has been redeemed in Christ, with the old heart of stone within it having been taken out, and a new heart that loves the law of God having been put in, a soul that desires to love this God because it has been redeemed by the blood of Christ, and because this soul has trusted in this Christ by faith. There's only two states in which our soul will go before God in death. Either a soul in rebellion against God that will be cast from His presence along with all of the angels of hell into outer darkness to continue in its rebellion forever and ever against this God, or a heart that is repented, a soul that is repented of its sin and turned to this Christ, fallen on its knees before the cross of Calvary and begged for the mercy of God to fall upon it. The only thing we're going to bring with us in death is the state of our immortal soul. Now there was one who was able to bring both into the presence of God. There was one individual who was able to go into the presence of God with both his immortal soul and his body, now made immortal. And that, of course, was Jesus. Upon His resurrection from the dead and His ascension to the right hand of the Father, He brought both an immortal body and an immortal soul into the presence of His Father, both which were pleasing in the Father's sight. And the reason why is because He had been obedient to the counsel of peace established between Himself and the Father. Jesus was vindicated in both body and soul at His resurrection because He had been obedient to His Father's will from before the foundations of the world. And if you don't know what I'm talking about when I talk about this counsel of peace, I would encourage you to go listen to the last 2 Wednesday nights in which I discussed this counsel of peace. He was vindicated by God. Thus He went into the presence of God with both an immortal body and an immortal soul, which means that a Christian worldview holds a high view of resurrection, specifically the resurrection of the body. A high view of the resurrection of the body, since that will be the moment at which God restores the immortal soul to a now immortal body in which we will live forever. The common Gnostic belief of much of Christianity today is that we get to shed this flesh and go and live with God as some sort of spirit beings, but that is utterly wrong from a biblical worldview. A biblical worldview sees God, sees Christ Jesus at the final trump, raising our bodies from the dust of the ground and putting our immortal souls back into it. Thus we live as human beings forever, because you're not human if you don't have a body. Adam was created body first, and then his immortal soul was put into us. And the fact of the matter is that that's the picture. That's what we will one day be. So on this side of the day of resurrection, on this side of the day of resurrection, everything that we pursue that is material will be left behind in death. Everything that we pursue that is material in nature will be left behind. Thus, Paul's point in this verse is that it is an utter waste of focus to pursue material gain only to leave it behind. It is an utter waste of focus. It's an utter waste of time. Or let me say it slightly differently. Our focus as believers should be on the things of God, the immortal things, rather than on the things of this world. The only thing that matters in death is the state of our soul. And so when Paul says, we brought nothing into the world and we cannot take anything out of the world, what he is saying to us is, while you may live in a world that is material, and while you might be entirely encumbered with the fact that you need this world to survive, a focus on the things of this world is a waste of time, because it isn't going to change your soul one little bit, except maybe in the negative. Which then leads Paul to give what I think in verse 8 is probably one of the most difficult statements of truth that are ever given to Christians. Difficult. He says this, but if we have food and clothing, with these we will be content. Now, notice first of all that Paul uses a we here. Changes the focus from you to we. Okay, what's he doing? He's including himself, right? So the use of the word we here clearly implies that Paul is speaking to those who are followers of Christ, those who belong to this Christ, just as he does, those who are committed to this Christ, just as he is. We, members of the church, he means, we, if we have this, then we will be fine. And so he includes himself in this. And I think that Paul, as you remember, had experienced a number of times over the course of his life when he had to learn contentment. Notice the key word there. Learn contentment. Why? Why do you have to learn it? Because it isn't natural, is it? As I said earlier, it's not natural. The world around us is designed to make us discontented. We have to learn to be content. Remember how he says it in Philippians 4? Not that I'm speaking of being in need, for I have learned in whatever situation I am to be content. I know how to be brought low, and I know how to abound. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and hunger, abundance and need. I can do all things. In other words, I can be content through him who strengthens me. Now, by the way, just as an aside, notice the context of that final verse. I can do all things. What are the all things there? Go out and build a huge bank account and accomplish the 2 Lexus in the driveway instead of 1 and all that other stuff. That's how some people interpret it, right? But the context is clearly the opposite of that. I have learned to be content with what I have. If God has blessed me with little, I've learned to be content with that. If the Lord has blessed me with much, I've learned to be content with that. So Paul states this here in verse 8, as though it applies to followers of Jesus unquestioningly. What Paul says here is, listen, here's the deal. For those of us who belong to Jesus Christ, this is an unquestioned reality. This is what ought to characterize every single person who calls themselves a follower of Jesus. If I have food and clothing, I'm fine. That's all I need. That's all I need. Namely, that our material lives should be so focused on eternal matters that we are concerned only about our basic needs. Everything else is unimportant. Godliness, as you remember, is an imitation of God. If we are going to imitate God, who specifically would we imitate? And the answer, of course, is the one who came to be our Savior. We should imitate him. Jesus walked around this world and he only had two things: the clothes on his back and the food that he was given along the way. He didn't own a home. He didn't have a car or a computer or a cell phone. Not that he could have. He didn't have any of those things. And here's what he said about it. Matthew 8, verse 20, foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Was that a complaint? No, it's just simply a matter of fact. Even God has given foxes some holes to live in, birds some nests to live in. I've got nothing, but that's okay, because I don't need anything else. I have all that I need because I have a strong connection to the Father. That's all that matters. I've always said, and I'm absolutely convinced of this, and you will never change my mind on this, that Paul, the apostle, was the greatest commentator on Jesus that ever lived. He was the greatest commentator on Jesus ever lived. People who say you should focus in your preaching less on Paul and more on Jesus are utterly in that sense, because Paul always was commenting on Jesus. In fact, these verses here, these two verses, are a commentary on several statements of Jesus himself on wealth and spirituality. Listen to the parallels as I read them. Matthew 16. What will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? What will it profit a man to gain everything that there is in the world and forfeit your soul? What do you bring before God on the final day? Nothing more than the state of your soul. Matthew chapter 6. Do not lay up for yourself treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal, but rather lay up for yourself treasures in heaven, etc. Right? Treasures in heaven. And how do we get treasures in heaven? The state of our soul. How about Luke chapter 16, verse 13? Jesus' words. No servant can serve two masters. Either you love the one and hate the other, or hate the one and love the other, right? You cannot serve God and money. Or some translations read mammon, which is just more than money, but all of material possessions. Or how about Matthew 19:24? Probably my favorite. Proves that Jesus had a tremendous sense of humor. It is easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. You could almost see him while he's saying that. It's easier for a rich man, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle, and smiling while he's doing it. You see, here's what Paul is trying to say, and here's what Jesus is saying, and here's what is obvious about both of these men as they speak of these things. It is the pursuit of the eternal that matters. It is the pursuit of the eternal that matters. Material contentment is a vital characteristic of the soul that loves God. Being content with what we have No matter how much we have, no matter how much God has blessed us with, the contentment in it is a vital characteristic of the soul that loves God. Because what's one of the questions that he's going to ask you when you stand before him in that soul? Was your focus on me? Or was your focus on that body you left behind in the grave? Which leads then to verses 9 and 10. What Paul will now do here is he will give what I think is probably the greatest warning that's ever been given to Christians in regards to material things. Probably the greatest warning. Paul says that this desire to be rich is one of the strongest pulls on fallen material beings in this world. It's a pull. Remember I said earlier that it is the tendency of sinners, it is the tendency of human beings, material human beings in a fallen world, to migrate from what we need to what we want, right? It's not enough for us just to pursue, this is what I need nothing more, therefore I will be content with this, but we move beyond that to what we want. Now let me just clarify for a moment here, if I might, before we get into this warning. Neither Paul nor Jesus specifically condemns wealth itself. All right, so let me just be clear here at this point. You might be hearing me saying that I think that all wealth is bad. I do not. And Paul doesn't either. Money is simply a amoral thing. Notice the word I used, amoral. Not immoral, amoral. The prefix a from the Greek simply is a negation. It means not moral. Not immoral in the sense of being something evil or sinful, but amoral, meaning not having a moral focus at all. The dollar bill that you have in your wallet is just that. It's a piece of paper with some green and black ink and other kinds of things on it, and that's all it is. It doesn't have any morality in and of itself. It is not evil in and of itself. What makes money or any other material gain evil is our intention towards it. When we focus on it more than we focus on God. That's why Jesus said it's more difficult for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven than a camel to go through the eye of a needle. Because the rich man's focus is in the wrong place. The rich man's focus is on that money, as though that money will save him in some way. Notice in verse 9, Paul does not say to be rich is an error. Rather, he says the desire to be rich is the error. And in verse 10, he doesn't say money is the root of evil. He says, rather, the love of money is the root of evil. Notice it's a emotional, or I would argue, a volitional response to these things. How do you react to money? How do you react to possessions, to things? Are they something that you desire and put greater focus on than you do upon your relationship to the living God? Or are they just things, just stuff? How you answer that determines what you are pursuing. What you are pursuing. And so here's the warning that Paul puts. The desire to be rich and the love of money, these two pursuits, are a great lure, L-U-R-E, lure away from the things of God. This is the problem that the false teachers at Ephesus are putting in the lives of the people there. They are luring them away from the things of God. You cannot serve both God and money. You cannot focus on both. It's impossible. Either you love the one and hate the other, or hate the one and love the other. And notice the lure is into a number of things. Into temptation. Into temptation. The desire for money, the love of money, the desire to be rich leads people into an unnatural desire never intended to be good for humanity. God never intended for us to be creatures who had such lusts. In the unfallen state prior to Adam sinning, Adam would have had control over the physical world in such a sense that his relationship with his Creator would have always been more important than the things of the world. until he fell. It's also a lure into a snare. A snare is simply another word for a trap, right? It's into a trap. Those who desire wealth find themselves trapped in the endless cycle of procure and protect. What do you got to do when you get it? You got to protect it. You got to keep it. You got to clutch it in such a way that someone doesn't steal it from you, right? Lay up for yourself treasures in heaven rather than treasures on earth where thieves break in and steal. That's the constant problem of the rich man. What does he got to do? Clutch it, protect it, hold on to it, make sure it doesn't get lost, make sure that it gets protected. We certainly don't want the government getting their 30%. So we got to do what we can do. But it becomes a cycle, it becomes a trap into senseless and harmful desires. Those who lust after money will also find themselves lusting after other things, because with money comes an opportunity to procure much more. Wouldn't you agree, Mr. Kraft? Some of you know what that reference is to, right? Yeah. It leads into ruin and destruction. It leads into the loss of both the material thing and the eternal thing. I've always been amazed by these people who win the lottery, and then a few years later, what do they got? They got nothing. They've lost it all. They've wasted it all. And in the meantime, they've lost their soul at the same time. They've sold it out. It leads into a lure of all kinds of evil, all of these things that lure the wealthy away from godliness to sin. And the final one, and the biggie, they are lured into wandering away from the faith. They wander away from the gospel. They wander away from the church. They wander away from teaching and discipline and discipleship in order to pursue their material things. They become apostates eventually to these things. And by the way, I think this is the statement at the end that Paul is thinking about here of the false teachers at Ephesus. Remember what he said back in chapter 1 and verse 19 when he said, there are some rejecting this who have made shipwreck of their faith, among whom are Hymenaeus and Alexander, who have handed over to Satan and have learned to blaspheme. These are men who had been teaching the church that you can love God and love money, and let me show you how to do it. Let me show you how to build a bigger bank account. Let me show you how to grow up in wealth as God wants all Christians to do, right? Because once you come to Christ, He wants to bless your life with all kinds of material prosperity and wealth, according to those guys on TV. And yes, it's true for them, but not so true for everybody else. Wandering away from the faith, abandoning the gospel, abandoning the things of this world, and their soul is lost. And they are lured into being pierced with many pangs. Now living a life filled with anxiety and worry and sorrow and loss. I don't know about you, but I don't see wealthy people any happier than unwealthy people. There's a lot of wealthy people. I know very few. But I don't see many of them that have a great deal of happiness. Their happiness, those who are truly wealthy and who love God, their happiness is in their love of God, not in the stuff they have in the bank. The lure of these things is into all of these dangers. But here's the thing. I could stand here and say this to you, and what's your response? Yeah, that's true, preacher, but you know what? I really would like to win the lottery. I'll be different from all the rest. I'll win the lottery, give 10% of it to the church, and then I'm going to be just as godly as I ever was. Really? See, the problem with this preaching is exactly this problem, right? We live in a world that is fundamentally discontented at its core, a world that's fundamentally material at its core. All of us, myself included, imbibe in this world day to day to day to day to day to day to day, moment by moment, every day. And so we hear this and we know it's true here. But how many of us have really stopped and said, yeah, it's true here too? Preachers preach on money constantly, don't they? It's one of our favorite subjects. And yet, it doesn't really change much in the life of the church. Why is that? And the answer is because of the world in which we live. It is the pursuit of the eternal that matters. To love the material things of this world is not true contentment. It is not characteristic of the soul that loves God. The soul that loves God does not love the things of this world. The soul that loves the things of this world does not love God. You cannot serve both God and money. So Paul is warning his young friend here. You need to teach your people this reality. They need to find their contentment in Christ. And they need to learn contentment. They need to learn it. Which might mean some terrible discipline that needs to be included in our lives. And when I say terrible discipline, I mean terrible in the sense that it's very counterintuitive to us, that we may actually have to say, you know what? I simply don't need that, or that, or that. Part of the reason that I dumped social media. I don't need it. I don't need it. So let me encourage you, my friends. Find your contentment in Christ, because you will never find it in the things of this world. And one day, you will die. And when you do, all that you will bring before the Lord is the state of your eternal soul. And what you will be judged on will be the motives of your heart. What did you love in this world? Did you love this world, or did you love Christ?